The first speaker I'd like to introduce is Doriane Coleman. She's a Duke parent and a professor of law at Duke Law School. She specializes in teaching and scholarship related to, it's a long list, so I'm looking at my notes, culture, women, children, medicine, and law. And her current work focuses on the differences between biological sex and gender identity, and the implications of those differences for institutions ranging from elite sport to education and medicine. She's also crazy fast, okay? She competed in the 800 meters in collegiate and international competition. She was the intercollegiate indoor champion in 1982 and the Swiss national champion in 1982 and 1983. So when I say fast, she's like really fast. And if you are going to be in Los Angeles, I just saw in my email that Doriane is actually going to be presenting a session called Duke Law Live Sex and Sport, which sounds kind of spicy, on March 5th. So look out in your email for that. Doriane Coleman.
So thank you very much. The operative word was actually "was fast," because it's been a really long time. Thank you, Nicole. I'm really glad to be here. Welcome back to all of you who are alums. It's really great always to have people in the building and to share the history of this place with you when you're here. I am also really glad to share the platform with my fellow panelists and along with you to hear about their current work. As Nicole mentioned, in this period, I'm studying or I'm working a lot on sex and specifically on sex as distinguished from and related to gender identity, because that's sort of a hot topic in this period, and it's really exploding in law, especially. This past fall, for the first time, this past fall semester, I taught a class called Sex in Law, which was specifically distinguished from, although also specifically related to gender in law. I point that out to say it's topical, but also that I'm using the word in that more specific way as I speak. So I'm studying in this period the definition of the word sex in law, the law's reasons for regulating sex according to that particular definition, and then the tools it's developed to regulate in particular for purposes of sex equality in the modern period. I'm going to say a few things about each of these, about the definition, the purposes, and the tools, and then to give you a sense of what's on my desk right now, because I know that's sometimes fun for folks. I'll read a few paragraphs from my current article, which is on Title IX, but I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then I look forward to your questions, so I'm not planning to take a long time. So a few words on the legal definition of sex. And before I start, I read this to myself a couple of times before I came over here just now, and it made me think, if you guys have seen the movie On the Basis of Sex, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie, that moment in the movie, and for those of you who haven't, I'll just recount it. There's a moment in the movie where she is editing a brief, one of her first briefs with her assistant, about sex in law. And she found herself saying sex, 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 sex over and over again. And so at one point her secretary said, or her assistant said, well, why don't you switch out half of them and use the word gender? And the point was for them to be synonymous, but for the men on the court not to keep reading the word sex, and so sort of stumble and not hear what she was trying to say. I am going to sound like that, except that I'm not going to switch out half the words because they mean something different for me and in law. So a few words on the legal definition. In the law over the centuries, sex wasn't specifically defined because the word wasn't considered complicated or controversial. It had always been used and understood in connection with separating males from females on the basis of our reproductive capacities. For example, according to this still standard definition from the American Heritage Dictionary, this year's edition, either of two divisions, designated male and female, by which most organisms are classified on the basis of their reproductive organs and functions. The word was understood early on, again in law, to refer not only to facts about our reproductive biology, but also to assumptions about what flowed naturally from that biology, what we call today sex stereotypes, so sex and sex stereotypes. If we have a uterus, a biological fact, then we are naturally caregivers, a societal assumption or stereotype based on that fact. So sex in law, the word sex, if you see on the basis of sex, wherever you see that in law, it includes both sex and sex stereotypes. Both aspects of this working definition, the sex part, the fact part, and then the assumptions part, are being challenged in this period in legal academic writing, in Congress, in state legislatures, and in the courts, including for the first time this term in October in the United States Supreme Court. Sex itself, in the context of the arguments at the court, but also in legislatures, et cetera, right, has been deconstructed beyond just the two divisions, into a bunch of aspects of sex. We know these to be aspects of sex. So brain sex or gender identity, genital sex, gonadal sex, endocrine sex, chromosomal sex. As a result, we see the claim in law and elsewhere that sex isn't binary, that there aren't just two divisions, that the law should recognize more divisions, for example, a third sex, or else a spectrum instead. That's on the sex side of sex. And then on the stereotype side of sex, we have the unmooring of stereotypes from their biological basis. So just before I said, if we have a uterus, then we're caregivers. The caregivers part is moored to the idea that we have a uterus, or not the idea, the fact that we have a uterus, right? The two are connected. Here, the move is to unmoor the fact from the stereotype, the stereotype from their biological basis. So the argument is that, for example, it's just an assumption, not a fact, that females get pregnant and males don't. It's just an assumption, not a fact, that males are faster, stronger, and more explosive than females. What is sex and who is male and female in law is currently in dispute. So just a few words about the law's reasons for regulating sex historically and in the modern period. So historically, the law cared about sex, and not even means historically, like 1200, 1300, all the way to the mid-1900s, right? The law cared about sex for identification purposes, so that people could be sorted primarily for the military, for marriage, for what was considered at the time proper sexual relations, and then for privacy, identification for those things. And then it regulated sex also for power. To establish males' authority over females in policy making with respect to money, property, and children primarily. And we're all familiar with this history, either because we've studied it or we just know it. It's in our bones, right? Some of the historical regulation of females was regarded or else disguised as protection, but regardless of how it was motivated, the effects were disempowering in relation to males. Today, the law continues to regulate sex for purposes of identification. We're all familiar with that on our IDs, et cetera, right? It continues to regulate sex for purposes of identification, including into the military and for privacy primarily in this period, and national security sort of, border crossings, including TSA and all of that. But otherwise, where the historical effect of regulation of sex in law was to disempower women, today it is to right that wrong. It is to secure equality for females in relation to males. And so as I'm telling you this story about definitions in law, but also, or traditional historical definitions in law, but also purposes, you're still hearing the two divisions, right? You're hearing the two divisions, and that continuing to drive what regulation is about. The law's preferred tools to achieve these ends of sex equality in the modern period are what we call sex neutrality in law, legal measures that say, for example, as Title IX does, Title VII as well, that the government and recipients of government funds can't discriminate on the basis of sex. They're just neutral as to sex, right? It's not for women or for men or equal to male to female, just says can't discriminate on the basis of sex neutrality. Under sex neutral measures, state actors and recipients of government dollars have to be blind to sex when they sort people and make decisions. They can't formally see it. If they see the people in the room, they might see it for themselves personally, but they can't see it in terms of regulation and policy making. But where neutrality or blindness doesn't work to achieve equality, For example, where not seeing sex actually hinders the progress to the goal, the law permits sex affirmative measures. We call that affirmative action when we talk about race. We don't usually talk about affirmative action for women and females, but it really is the same idea, right? Sex affirmative measures. The ones we're most familiar with include pregnancy protections at work, diversity outreach that sees sex as well as race, and then the measures I've written a lot about recently, the sports exception, for example, to Title IX's general non-discrimination rule. Title IX has a general sex-neutral provision and then exceptions that allow for sex affirmative measures where sex-neutral measures don't do the work. In my work, I argue, and I've just been descriptive so far, but I'm going to tell you what my argument is. In my work, I argue that we should pay attention to the implications of redefining the operative words on the law's ability to continue to contribute to sex equality. So that you can have a sense of this argument, I'll end with a few paragraphs from my current project, which is co-authored with Mike Joyner at the Mayo Clinic and then Donna LaPiano, who was for a long time the president and chief operating officer of the Women's Sports Foundation. The article is called Reaffirming the Commitment it's long, but it's essentially reaffirming the commitment to Title IX sport, right? And so I'll just read and then we can start talking. Biological sex matters. It is real, not socially constructed, and it affects people's lives, opportunities, and experiences in even the most benign or egalitarian situations and societies. In particular, because of their different reproductive biology and secondary sex characteristics, females in general have different physical capacities and experiences than males. This is true regardless of how we identify. Sex matters in ways that are empowering and celebrated, and also in ways that are damaging and censored. For females, physical, including sexual violence perpetrated primarily by males, is a destructive commonplace, as are the routine exclusions and subordinations they experience based on their phenotype and their reproductive biology. Sometimes these exclusions and subordinations are driven by false stereotypes, but they may also be driven by a reluctance to reimagine structures to accommodate real and otherwise appreciated sex-linked physical differences. Regardless, sex is relevant, if not defining. Sex equality also matters. Although we can imagine a world in which sex is not relevant or defining, in which we classify people on entirely different terms or else not at all, this isn't ours. As ours exists, because sex matters, so does sex equality. The United Nations is not wrong to think about the world's population in male and female halves, because this is how we tend in the first instance to sort ourselves, and then how our experiences and opportunities line up. They generally line up this way, at least in the first instance, without regard to race, class, or gender identity. Because of this, it's also not wrong to make anti-subordination commitments specifically to the female half of the world's population. This should not be our only anti-subordination commitment, but it is an entirely rational and important one. Sex equality can sometimes be achieved without affirmative consideration of sex, and in this period in the United States, sex-blind policies are preferred. But when sex blindness would be counterproductive, ineffective, or insufficiently remedial, sex-conscious approaches should be tools in the equality toolbox. These are especially useful where, to fix inequities, it is important to see, not to erase the female body. This includes at least aspects of the workplace, the military, medicine and biomedical research, and competitive sport. If we were to have to ignore sex differences in these circumstances, sex equality would remain elusive.
Okay, questions?
I don't know that much about Title IX except being on the field hockey team at Duke at the very beginning of all of that, a long, long time ago. But what are the threats right now, or are there? Maybe there aren't any, but as you look at that, what are the threats and or opportunities in the context of Title IX?
That's a great question. What we're seeing is, in fact, starting in January, bills have been proposed to state legislatures all around the country, and a bill was proposed in the House of Representatives at Congress to to prohibit trans girls and trans women from competing in girls and women's events, on girls and women's teams and girls and women's events, unconditionally. In other words, categorically, unconditionally, regardless of whether they had been through male puberty or not, et cetera, right? And those bills are a response to a quiet effort over the last 10 years by advocates for trans girls and trans women to change state athletic association policies to permit their unconditional inclusion. And so there's categorical exclusion from proponents on the right and categorical unconditional inclusion from proponents or advocates for trans girls on the left. And neither is consistent with Title IX as it currently exists and currently is imagined. In the NC2A context and in international sport, we've developed accommodations, which is sort of the classic way to approach kind of collisions of competing interests. We developed accommodations that would allow for inclusion in circumstances that don't defeat the purposes of Title IX. But the fight right now, at least publicly, in part because the Republicans have identified this as an election issue, and so they're sort of fomenting political hay over it. The fight is at the extremes, and one of the things that I'm trying to do with my co-authors is to argue that there's sort of the rational middle ground that would continue to protect girls and women's sport, but allow inclusion in ways that aren't what we call category defeating. You're welcome.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Cool.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak to the recent controversy over either intersex people competing in athletics or someone like Caster Semenya, who is a female but has just naturally high testosterone levels. Can you talk about what standards are being used and how you think those ought to change, if any?
Sure. I actually testified in the Semenya case at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland in February, and one of the factual predicates that people are not familiar with is that she's actually not biologically female. She has testes and normal male T levels. Her intersex condition is one that involves the underdevelopment in utero of the external male genitalia, and so you're born kind of with ambiguous external genitalia at birth. I don't need to talk about Caster particularly. She's a wonderful person and a really fantastic advocate for her situation and other athletes in her situation. But I mean, it's not so much the trans issue that's been a challenge for sport. Historically, it's really been intersex athletes. So what we would call in sport, or in science, what we would call biological males who are born and identified at birth either for just because it's, the choice is made in confusing circumstances or whatever, the choice is made to put female on the birth certificate, and so the kids grow up and can compete in their local athletic context as girls and women, and then they come into international sport with the power that they have because they're actually male, and that's been a real problem. When I refer to the trans rules are the same as the intersex rules, just to cut to the chase. It's to include as long as testosterone levels are reduced to the female range. And so that's considered an accommodation that is available if athletes in those circumstances want to continue to compete in women's events, notwithstanding otherwise the biological basis for the classification.
Hey, thank you very much.